This podcast interview took place before the current New South Wales lockdown conditions. You're listening to Developmental, Property and the Mind podcast, where development industry insight meet mindset with Trafalgar CEO Joe Aboud. Join one of the property industry's most free thinkers as he explores the path to success and contentment.
Today we've got Chris Johnson, who was one of our first guests on Developmental about 18 months ago. Episode 4 in our first season, entitled Dare to Dream. At that time he was CEO of Urban Taskforce, and since he's moved into a very active retirement and has now produced a fantastic book called Mid-Rise Urban Living. Welcome back, Chris.
Oh, thanks, Joe. It's good to be sitting in these fabulous chairs again, having a bit of a dialogue. The world has moved on, coronavirus, all that sort of stuff, but great to have a chat.
I mentioned that you have retired from the task force not long after we had spoken back in 2019. What have you been up to since then?
Well, look, I pulled out the end of 19 and I've done a little bit of consulting work with a few people, just keeping my hand in. But I realised once the coronavirus, and I wanted to travel, I thought, wow, if I pull out a full-time work, wouldn't it be great to lob into a Greek island somewhere for 2 or 3 months and do a bit of fishing and walk down to the restaurants around the little bay and all that sort of stuff. But, of course, you can't do that, the coronavirus. So I thought, well, I'd better do something else. My wife's very good about writing books, and I've written quite a lot of books. I've written a dozen books or so, and she said, look, there's a London publisher called Lund Humphreys who are looking for people to write particular books, and they're running a series which is about urban planning. And so I contacted them and had a good old chat to them, and so I set myself the task over 2020 to really write a book about urban planning, get all the images, do all the research, follow it all up, package it all up and try and get it out and done and dusted early in 2021, and I've actually achieved it, which is fabulous.
It looks like a terrific book pack full of useful insight and information. It's called Mid-Rise Urban Living, as I sort of mentioned before. Your focus in that book is the concept of the missing middle. What do you mean when you talk about the missing middle?
Well, look, I've got involved a lot, particularly as government architect, that's way back, but also in the Department of Planning where I was for 4 years, and also 8 years as Urban Taskforce CEO in the community debate about growth and change and development in cities. And of course the Urban Taskforce members are the risk takers, the people who get out to try and make projects happen. They are building all the new housing, and it's absolutely staggering to me that whenever a new building goes up, the community blame the developer. The developers built it, but all they're doing is following the planning rules and working in the planning system to try and make this work. So what I've found in all that debate is a lot of people are very worried about high-rise. They think these tall towers are totally different to their lifestyle. There's a group called the Save Our Suburbs group, SOS, and they believe that Sydney's suburbs are under threat as the population grows. But on the other hand, you can't keep spreading low-rise suburban houses forever horizontally away from the Sydney CBD where a lot of the jobs are. We've got the 3 cities, so that's helping, but the debate between the suburbs and high-rise, I think, is missing something that could be a way forward between those two. So between the 2-storey house, backyard, front yard and all that sort of stuff, living in an apartment tower of 30, 40 stories high, and the missing middle was proposed by the New South Wales government as being 2-storey townhouses. But I think that's not really a missing middle compared to the 2 areas I've talked about. So we promoted in the Urban Taskforce through a magazine we put out, the missing middle should be mid-rise apartments. That is 6-storey, 8-storey type apartments. So they're big enough to have underground car parking. They're tall enough to have a lift. So a lot of them would be for the ageing population, older people. So you've got a lifestyle issue that you can cover. But they're also at a height that fits within the treetops. The gum trees, eucalypts in Sydney can grow to 6, 8 stories or so, and you therefore have a character that is much less threatening to those communities who all say, oh, high rise, we don't want it. So the missing middle, in my opinion, should be not 2-storey townhouses, but the 6-storey, 8-storey fabric for cities.
I mean, you've been an advocate for high-rise for as long as I've known you, and I think I'm starting to see that, or we are starting to see that specifically in Sydney CBD when it comes to those, extraordinarily high towers that are now being approved. George Street Cinemas site that's recently been approved, which is, a fantastic outcome, we believe. And I think that's sort of leading the way into the future of height and high-rise development in Sydney CBD, which is fantastic. But you've also been an advocate for creativity and allowing a lot more creativity in the design approach. What are your views around that at the moment?
Well, it's an interesting question. Just on the high-rise, look, I've been championing high-rise, and high-rise in the right location must happen.
Absolutely.
In the CBDs, in Parramatta, in Penrith, in a whole lot of top cities around Sydney, not just the three major cities, but many places, high-rise is entirely appropriate. And I think that the people living in those suburban houses can agree that, look, they're over there where the shops and the railway station, all that sort of stuff is, and things. So I think it's between those two that we've got to look at. But I think you're spot on also that creativity is crucial. And the big danger of a planning system is it dumbs everything down to one single solution. And everyone does the same thing. And in the research for this book I found online a lot of dialogue in America about how they all look the same, these apartment buildings. They're just blancmange, they're all identical, they're all the same thing. And it's partly because the planning rules say, make sure your balustrades this high, the windows, then this, then that. And by the time, if you try to change it, do something different, you end up in a battle with council planners saying, no, that's not what the rules are, you've got to make it all look like this. And the end product is they all look exactly the same. And America, of course, is the centre of individuality, of a democratic society where individuals want to reinforce their position, as opposed to China or Russia, which are much more sort of socialist, Marxist sort of countries where people probably don't want to look a bit different. They want to all tone in and feel like they fit in. So it seems anomaly that we start building cities that look like they're in China or Russia, yet we're in these sort of countries that are about freedom and individuality and how people want to live their lives, about diversity. Also, we're very multicultural. Look at Sydney and the number of cafes, restaurants we've got around the place. It's food from all over the place. When you go to China, there's only Chinese restaurants. So the position I've been pushing is that we need our buildings to reflect our individualism, our diversity, our multicultural society, that they shouldn't all look exactly the same. And the danger of the planning system is to force us into that.
Yeah, look, I think I agree. I think the planning system's hijacked full control of these outcomes, and we're really guided and directed by the planning legislation, the rules and regulations that are centralised around our planning system. And as a result, it's taking away from the creative flair that I think this city craves and it lacks. I've never seen more mundane outcomes than what's been happening.
Spot on, Joe. And the reason I think is this, that the planners who are in councils particularly are not trained to understand creativity, understand design, they understand planning rules, but also because there's been such a negative press, media and politicisation, I guess, of developers per se, that they don't want to look like they're helping a developer. So if it looks like you said, we've made this a bit different because the developer wanted to be a bit different, it'll look like you've done something wrong. So if you make it all look just like the boring planning rules look, you can't be accused of being corrupt or doing some deal or trying to work with someone. And that's a terrible sort of indictment, I think, of a system that can lead to an end product that's not all that exciting. So in the book, I've tried to slightly overplay the weird and the wonderful, some exotic ways of doing buildings, of doing architecture that, are a bit different. And part of the story there is that as opposed to an individual house, an apartment building fundamentally has a facade back to the street. And it's like a big billboard in a way. And that facade could either be terribly boring or lined up in horizontal lines, or it could be quite dynamic and move up and down. It could have golden arches on it. It could do all sorts of things that look much more interesting. So I think that those buildings have a responsibility, as well as solving the planning internally about the building and getting all the apartments and getting the lifestyle, to present something back to the community that's enriching.
Yeah, look, I think a good balance would help. I mean, looking from the outside in, so to speak, do you feel more hopeful at all that New South Wales is getting the message that we need to be more flexible and not less? Or
Well, there is currently in draft form this design and place SEP.
what do you think about that?
Well, look, the idea and the concepts are fine. The reality I worry about dramatically, because to raise all these issues about sort of character and individual style and all these sorts of things, and try to say this is flexible, etc. My worry is that the people doing it are not connected into those systems-based planners who will probably turn it into an anonymous document rather than opening it up. And what I've said at one of the presentations we had was that we need a different way to assess projects if you want to have a bit of design and difference and excitement.
I'm sitting on a couple of panels at the moment on representing task force. I'm probably a little bit more vocal than most and been chosen to do so. I've been really driving the government architect to really think a little bit differently. So let's go back to this. Let's take the red pen approach. There's nothing wrong with that if it saves time, if it saves money, if it creates a more efficient way to provide approvals and supply that is going to help us in the long term. Both downward pressure on pricing, better design outcomes, a much more pleasant experience during the approval process, not 4, 5 and 6 years. Let's avoid the red tape and, more and more panels. And I mean, I got one project at the moment. It's taken me, 7 or 8 panel meetings. It doesn't need 7 or 8 panel meetings. It needs some guidance in the first instance and then let everybody go away and do their job. Give a little bit more power and I guess responsibility to the architect himself to be able to deliver the outcome.
Of course.
And not be, clouded by all of this red tape and planning requirements and numerical standards that, create this cookie cutter approach. I mean, we've been really pushing via those panels at the moment to try to get an outcome. I think she's listening. I really do. I really believe she's trying.
I think she is, but I'm not sure if she understands the rest of the planning system. Because I went to a talk the Institute of Architects ran. They had a panel afterwards, and one of them was a planner from Parramatta Council, I think it was, who said, look, this all sounds fabulous, but we're not changing our LEP on our DCP for another 5 years. None of this is going to have any impact. It's all very nice what you're saying, but we know what we're doing.
Just another layer, right?
And this is the problem. So you've got to take it out of that system. You've got to say, look, there are 2 ways you can go through the planning system. You either put your head down, follow all the rules and don't change a bit and you get a fairly boring building, or you go to some other process where people actually want difference, encourage you.
There needs to be a culture change.
It's a cultural change. It's a fundamental cultural change.
Yep.
But there's another danger, though, and that is that you don't want in these design review panels an architect who says, look, I know what you should do it my way. Because
that's what they do anyway.
I know, but,
Sorry.
but you've engaged your architect. You've got to get your stuff. Well, I remember a friend of mine, an architect, who was doing some stuff in the city of Sydney, and he had his drawings on bits of paper, and the planner there, so I got his pen out and started redoing it and drawing all over. So the next meeting he came in with his laptop. No paper at all, so the guy couldn't
draw over it,
all over it. And he said, here's the plan. Did it deliberately because he knew if it was on paper, these people couldn't resist trying to change the shape of it. And that's not their role. The role is not to take over the design. It's to help the designer you've already appointed reach the best solution for the client and everybody.
Look, I think some of the examples in your book, paint an awesome picture of exactly where these things should go. A couple of projects that you've mentioned in there, a couple in particular, and I'll start naming them, and let's have a quick chat about each one of those, I guess. In Singapore, the rooftop garden that is located on the Wuha's Kampong Admiralty building. Talk to me about that.
Well, look, it's a very, very interesting project. I have visited Singapore a number of times and been to Woha's office. Woha are a very interesting architectural office who are 2 people. One is from Singapore and one's from Australia, Richard Hassel, the HA. And they've developed an approach to architecture that understands tropical issues, because it's very tropical in Singapore, but they also understand humanity and human-scaled issues. Now, this project, which is called Kampong Admiralty, the two words are quite important. Admiralty is because there is a railway station right next door called Admiralty. So this is TOD, Transit-Oriented Development, right next to a railway station.
Mm-hmm.
But Kampong is a Malaysian word meaning village.
Okay.
So what they've tried to do in building this building, which is mainly for older people, it's a mixed development, older and younger people as well, but quite a lot of older people, is give it the feeling of being like a village. So the ground floor is quite open, so they have outdoor markets on the ground floor continually. So the community are able to go down there and get food and eat food and things. There are little pods that it's broken up into where people live in a more communal sense. But the bit you mentioned, which is the landscape and the garden up on the rooftop, is just staggering. It's not just a couple of pot plants. This is a forest up there almost, and trees and greenery and landscape. Because in the Singapore climate, high rainfall and humid temperatures, you can grow things very well.
It could be interesting to understand the sort of soil depths and stuff that they've worked there to be able to
Yep.
sustain that kind of a
Well, they
landscape.
do. In Singapore, they developed some years. Well, it goes right back to Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew was the founder of Singapore in a way, and set it all up as a separate sort of country. And he called it the Garden City.
Mm-hmm.
He developed this concept that it should be a garden city. And they developed then a planning rule that if you incorporated landscape, you got 10% extra floor space, maybe more. In certain circumstances. And the University of Singapore did a lot of research on green roofs and how you got the benefits with a green roof of absorbing the rain into the soil and the sort of systems. They've got quite good drainage systems, etc. How it also helps clean the air, because landscape's very good at absorbing CO2s and cleaning the air. Helps with acoustics.
Well, that's the cycle of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the cycle of life, right?
That's the cycle of life. So you bring it in. But this firm, Woha, they've got a design philosophy that every time they design a building, they want to put back the same amount of landscape that used to be on the site before they did the building.
Yeah, they used to laugh at a rooftop garden
Yep.
back in the day when we used to practice. You know.
So what they've done is they've put what used to be on the ground floor on the site itself up on the roof, and it's a whole garden. But even more than that, in the garden is a playground, because what's incorporated up there is a preschool. And you think this is a bit odd in a place of old people, but it's all about trying to mix different communities. The old people then connect to the younger people, the kids, etc., and give them an interesting life. And it's an interesting issue in Singapore that there is a growing older population, same in Australia. It used to be the older population lived with their kids, but kids are moving out of that a bit. So this is becoming a new approach to the aged in Singapore. So it's actually a little bit taller than my normal mid-rise. It's about 10 or 12 stories, but compared to Singapore, which goes up to 80 stories, it's actually mid-rise. And they've done quite a few buildings where they just incorporate landscape and greenery and things in it. So I think it's an interesting message as to how architecture can be a bit more sensitive with nature and work with it. And it's starting to happen in Sydney at Central Park on Broadway,
Fraser's building, yeah.
covered in all the greenery and landscape there. And others are doing this as well.
Which is rather attractive, you know, and the beauty about that is it constantly changes, you know. It's never the same looking building any day, right?
Well, the one on Broadway, Jean Nouvel is the architect, and a guy called Patrick Blanc is the landscape architect out of Paris. And he's got, each facade has got a different type of growth. So they change through the seasons, but north is different to south and east and west. So you do get differences happening around it, and that's a really nice thing.
What do you make of that reflective element on the top of that, though?
Well, that's an interesting issue because, and I was involved in doing plans for the Minister for Planning at the time, Frank Sartor, as to what should happen on the site there. So the site for Central Park has the UTS tower just over the road. So if there's going to be any tall buildings on the site, you'd connect it closely to that one, so it'd relate to it. Problem is, that was on the north of the site. So it was throwing a shadow down to the lower part of the site, which is where Chippendale and all the warehouses and terrace houses of the low side came.
So it was deflecting
So the
shadow.
answer was to bounce light down to the back there. So,
Interesting.
So what happens is the sun goes onto the lower roof, one of the buildings, bounces up to that hovering bit, and it's not total glary sunlight, but it's enough light to balance it all out.
Deflect the shadow.
Yeah. So it's quite a clever solution, I think.
Interesting. I want to take you to the waterfront of Amsterdam now. MVRDV's Solidam building, which is pretty interesting. Looks like an eclectic mix of shipping containers almost, Yeah,
it is.
Talk to me about that.
Well, the book tries to cover examples from Asia, like the WOHA, Europe, and America, etc. So the one in Amsterdam by MVRDV are a Dutch firm that are very inventive. They do a lot of books. They get exhibitions. They really test every project. They try to do something different. And this one is not on the land, it's just in the water in Amsterdam with piles that go down to the bottom. And they've got little bridges going across to it, so it almost looks like it could float away. It can't, of course, it's going to stay there. But they didn't want it to look like one single building, so it's multicoloured. There are different colours to it, and it does look, as you say, like a series of containers stacked up on it. And in fact, the container terminal is not far from that site. Okay. So it draws a bit of reference from that sort of area as well.
Clever.
And things. So I think it's a building that is different. Apparently, a lot of tours in Amsterdam by boat go past and everyone takes photographs of that building as they go past again, which I think is a sign of its success. It's not just something boring, it's something different.
Once again, sensitive about its environment and the way it responds to its surroundings.
Exactly.
Not necessarily trees, but in this particular case, ships, shipping containers, the waterfront, all that kind of stuff.
That's right.
Clever in its approach. Victoria Park, Sydney, garden apartments done by none other than Chris Johnson.
Look, when I was the government architect way back from 95, 2005, I found that this group, the Save Our Suburbs group, attacked the government all the time. I decided I'd work with Landcom, who are developing out at Victoria Park, a series of buildings and intervene a little bit to try to do something that handled what the Save Our Suburbs people were talking about. And when I really listened to them, what they're talking about is they didn't want just horizontal bands going on forever and going up forever. They wanted something that looked like individual houses rather than anonymous places. So what I tried to do was make a checkerboard plan to the building, 2 stories high, with big outdoor balconies where you could get landscape trees and gardens and things. And so the building would look like, it's about 5 or 6 stories high, a series of houses, checkerboard, put on top of each other.
And moving in and out.
And moving in and out, because pop out, and so the thought was, well, that's my place. I can see it now. It's quite clear.
So
it's
identifying with each resident separately, but unified.
And on top of that, we designed the streets so that the swale, the water ran into the middle of the street, and we put trees in the middle of the street, and branches came across and created quite a nice environment. So you've got a scale that works with the trees, that's got a broken down, more human scale, and looks like a series of houses rather than just anonymous place that people are contained in. So that was quite an important building at the time, and it didn't lead to, I thought it might lead to hundreds of these things being done, but it didn't quite happen. But it does, and it's partly because the planning rules, again, don't encourage that.
Well, they don't allow you to. There's no flexibility to be able to do this, No. You're so constrained with floor space, setbacks, heights, various things there, that the fluidity or the creativity is limited because you got to fit it all into a small box, and that is restrictive in its approach, right?
But so this is where Landcom are involved as a government agency, so they could push the rules a bit.
Yeah, two different sets of rules for
I know,
two different
but
walks
the
of
same
life.
should
almost.
happen for everybody. Every development should be able to explore these new ideas, do something a bit different, and sure, it might be a metre or 2 or 3, 10, I don't know, whatever, higher than it was meant to be, or something is not quite as, because it's not quite as set back as far, because some bits go out and some bits go in, averages still work quite well. You should be able to do all those sorts of things.
Chris, the planning proposal process was a process that was brought into legislation to be able to create a clear path for rezoning. It was put there to encourage an increased rate of housing supply. It was built there as a clear pathway for the developer and council to understand where it was going. We all know back in the day there was no formal process for rezoning. It was kind of just go to council, lodge it over the counter and hope to God they're going to deal with it. What we've been noticing of late is the planning proposal process. Although I feel it's a good process, I thought it would have been a successful process if it was, executed fairly and correctly, across all local councils. We're finding a pattern of local councils are using the process to increase value in their properties. Every major development in every major local LGA or local council, most of them, a vast majority of the planning proposals that are approved or are successful, are council-owned properties. Once again, we see this. The Landcom push was able to create a better outcome because they're a little bit more flexible with them and have got a bit more clout. Yep. Again, we see councils running their own agendas to almost compete and deliver housing in some cities. And once again, there doesn't seem to be a fair approach with this process.
Oh, look, I agree. Look, it's totally unfair that only the government agency can twist the rules a bit. Everyone should be able to do it, and there's just as much more, a lot more, I think, energy, inventiveness, creativity out in the private sector. That's what private sectors are good about. They're good about reinventing things, about coming up with new ideas, about testing the market and trying to understand ways forward. And the system should encourage that.
Look, to a degree, I think we can take a leaf out of the Melbourne book. I think Melbourne as a city, in my opinion, has some much more superior architecture and better outcomes in their city with the buildings and the creativity that's encouraged in Melbourne and the Melbourne architects. One particular example in your book is Orbis Apartments by ARM at Albert Park in Melbourne, which for mine is way ahead of its time. It encourages creativity, and it's a fine example of giving them enough latitude or scope to be very creative in their approach, right?
Spot on. Look, ARM, Ashton Raglan McDougall are very creative architects. They don't believe in planning rules, quite frankly. They'll have to say they do to get their approvals, but they're, and in fact they don't like doing competitions up in Sydney, because in Sydney you basically you define an envelope, you say the building's got to look like this, and then you have a competition to make the facade look a bit pretty. And they say that's not a competition. The competition should be about really innovating and doing things.
Yeah, pushing the result.
And their building's a bit like that. The one you mentioned, Orbis, it's got scalloped facades on. It's about 6 stories high, and it's got these sort of curved, golden covered elements made of aluminium, which have got the balconies cut back into them, and it's deliberately trying to present something of real interest back to the streetscape. It still works as an apartment building. There are still the balconies in it, a bit like what I was trying to break it down from lots of horizontal lines in the Victoria Park one. This one does it by using the big scalloped gold-shaped elements on the outside of the building. And so they, in their architecture, try to do lots of very interesting things. They did another very interesting building in the middle of Melbourne, which when you look at it from a distance, you can see that there's a patterning they've put on the building that's got actually an Aboriginal man you can read into the elevation. This is about a 30-storey high building.
It's almost like op art, right?
It is, and you can see it, and people think, wow, have I seen that properly? What's happening here? But if buildings can talk to us like that, that's a fabulous thing. I mean, way back in early days, this is a bit of real history, but Viollet-le-Duc in Paris used to sort of very worried that buildings were losing their role to communicate to the public because of the printing press. In the Hunchback of Notre Dame, the book he wrote, had a chapter in it called This Will Kill That, and he thought that the role of buildings was to present stories to the community. And they had carvings and stone figures on them and things like that, and he thought the printing press was going to stop it, but unfortunately it's the planning rules have stopped it. The planning rules have stopped buildings being able to communicate as interesting objects back to a broader community. people like ARM in Melbourne are trying to get back to those principles, that you should be able to present something. There's another very interesting one I've got in the book by them in Perth, which the old site used to be one that made fizzy drinks. And the outside of the building now has got lots of circular bubbles all over it that looks like bubbles from a drink bottle sort of coming up as a memory of what the site used to have on it and things. So they use slightly quirky methods, but at least it gives a story that people think, well, I wonder what that is, and you can learn and understand, and it makes it different to others.
Shows a connection to where it came from, and
absolutely, that's true.
Uses in earlier times and stuff like that. I think that's really important. Which takes us on to a little bit of a different topic, like writing a book. I mean, this is not just a memoir; it's almost a textbook. It's a book that I think is something that should be read by everyone in industry. There's clearly a lot of work there. How did you get started?
Well, I bounced a number of topics off with Lund Humphreys, the publishers in London. They do a lot of architectural books and have for years, about 80 years they've been going for, I think. And they've done major books by Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, and some of the famous people of architecture, etc. They are a slightly academic publisher, and they therefore do connect to universities. And so they were keen to have a book that was educational, that took people through a journey. It is, by being an academic book, it's got all the references and quotes and those bibliographies and those sorts of things in it. But when I was in the Urban Taskforce, I'm coming to the question in a slightly longer way, I did a lot of opinion pieces for newspapers, about 1,000 words. 800 to 1,000 words. And what I found is in 800 words or so, you can really get a good story out. So this book I broke down to a series of 800-word essays. So I took the history of this mid-rise building type, Paris, Barcelona, Berlin, New York. New York, for instance, there's this famous case where Jane Jacobs, who's a woman who wrote most incredible books about architecture and planning, etc. And she battled the area of New York where she was, West Village, was going to be bulldozed and new concrete towers put up. She fought it, said, no, we want this 6-story, 8-story development. We want it where new buildings can fit into it as well, and things. So I've then written a 800-word essay around what she did. And I built the book up by taking those sort of issues and following it up. I also looked at the different types of mid-rise buildings. That there are some that are very linear and basically go on for ages, so defining the edge of a street. And there's some in Barcelona that are like that. I looked at ones that are more curvilinear because with computers nowadays we don't have to be just straight lines, and there's some examples in the book of incredible flowing shapes and curved type buildings. I looked at green buildings like the one in Singapore. I also looked at affordability because that's a crucial issue, and there are even examples from India in there of mid-rise apartment buildings that are done at a budget and those sort of things. So all of it follows that through. Finally, I also, after doing all the case studies, looked at ways forward and found that a number of people had done research in this area. One, surprisingly, is the Prince of Wales Foundation, good old Prince Charles, in the UK. And they've put a whole publication out about mid-rise living and the value of that building type for London and other parts of the UK. I found that in Melbourne, Rob Adams, the planner for the City Council, had done an incredible scheme along each tramway leading out from Melbourne to put mid-rise, 6-story, 8-story, along all those routes with shops at the bottom of them and restaurants and things. So I found that Jan Gell, the Danish architect, had produced a book through his office where he set down 8 or 9 ways forward that you could do these sorts of things. So I've included all that as well. So a lot of research, a lot of getting onto Google. I must admit it's a lot easier these days to find things through computer systems. But I also know a lot of people, and that was quite useful as well.
Mate, an amazing book. There's a world of information. Excuse the pun, but it's very worldly in there. I think it's a must read, as we mentioned before, to everyone in the industry, local councils, planners. I think the planners will get a good read out of this one. So in your next chapter now, in post the book, how do you stay energized and motivated? What drives you?
Well, like most people, I think you need achievable task to focus on.
So you still got to plan it.
You still got to plan things, you still get going. So I'm doing a number of projects where I've connected with some people in the development world to try, where they've got projects that are a little bit difficult to pull off. So I'm giving them strategic advice as to how you get there. And when you look at some of them, you think, this is crazy. The planning rules wouldn't allow some fabulous solution here. So I'm trying to manipulate a bit the design and place SEP. I'm trying to manipulate the Productivity Commission report that criticised the planning system and said, look, it's taking too long, it's too convoluted, and therefore we should be able to say, look, as a response to that, here's a way forward to do things. So by understanding the big picture of what people are saying, and this comes out of Treasury, the productivity report, the other comes out of the Department of Planning. The essence, you can twist the essence of those, I think, to help an argument for projects. But then you run into the mindless battle of mid-level planners who don't want to do anything different. Look, a good example is the Archibald Prize, the one in the art gallery, etc. Now, they don't have a lot of mid-level artists or failed artists, basically, sort of writing rules as to how to win, what you got to do, and all these sort of things. They want diversity, they want innovation, they want different things, and they have a mixture of artists and other critics involved in it. So the process actually encourages innovation, and the assessment of it does that as well. The planning system doesn't have any of that.
Chris, how do you think COVID has affected the way people want to live these days?
There has been some discussion, for instance, as to whether the coronavirus issue has changed the way people want to live. There's some suggestion that people are not going to want to live in cities any longer. They're all going to flee out to the bush somewhere and live on a paddocks of land remote from places. I don't think that's going to happen. Although I do notice that some areas, I've got a place down Kangaroo Valley, and it seems that prices are going up down there because people want to get out of the city and be there. So I think some people are going to misuse the pandemic in the planning system to say, look, urban lifestyles are not going to be desirable because of, you have to wear a mask all the time or something. I think that's totally wrong. I think there's a trend around the world for people to want to have a more urban lifestyle, and that's where you don't have to have everything in your own house, that you can go and get your coffee downstairs, is what I do. I live down at Walsh Bay, which is on the cover of the book, that lifestyle. You get a view, you get coffee downstairs, you've got the theatres right next door, you walk to work. It's just a more communal lifestyle. So instead of your zone of living being the front garden, back garden and the house, the zone of living is the city and the precinct and the park around the corner, and it's engaging, and a lot of people want that type of lifestyle. Not everyone, sure, that's fine, but and that's what this mid-rise urban living is trying to encourage. So I'm keen to just get involved in more examples where I can get out and help make these sort of things happen.
That's amazing. Inspiring that, you still got the energy to do that. Absolutely amazing to talk to you again, Chris. Thank you so much. And I look forward to talking to you again next time.
Good on you, Joe. And thanks for your leadership in this area as well.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for listening to Developmental, Property and the Mind podcast. Stay tuned for our next episode, available wherever you get your podcasts. Or to talk to Joe, visit trafalgar.com.au. That's TRIFALGA.com.au.